He used to say silence was peaceful, but after the funeral it felt more like fog, thick and endless. The cabin sat tucked against a slope of the Smoky Mountains, where morning mist rose slow and steady, like it too didn't want to face the day. It was an old place, creaky in the joints, built by hands that knew how to split timber and stack stone. Inside, the quiet stretched long. Walter Harris, 68, woke before the birds most days. Not because he wanted to, but because the silence would settle too deep if he let it. He moved slow in the mornings, more out of rhythm than age. Put on the same flannel boiled, the same water, poured the same tea. He still set 2 mugs out by habit, one on each side of the old oak table. Her side hadn't been touched in 4 years. He didn't talk to the mug anymore. That ended when his daughter passed last winter. Some grief hardens you. Some strips you raw again. When they brought Ellie up from Atlanta, 13 years old and already hollowed out by loss, he didn't know what to say. He wasn't the kind of man who filled space with words. Her mama had been better at that. She arrived with a small suitcase and a bigger silence. Moved into the upstairs room without much fuss. No slamming doors, no music, no arguments. Just quiet, like she was trying not to disturb the air. And Walter, he just let it be. It had been 2 months since Ellie came to live with him, and in that time their house hadn't felt much like one. Meals were eaten in near silence, save for the clink of silverware and the occasional creak of a floorboard. The girl didn't cry, not in front of him, but he heard her sometimes muffled behind the bedroom wall, and when she didn't cry, she drew. Animals, mostly. Soft pencil sketches on lined paper. Bobcats, deer owls, wild things with old eyes. She left them everywhere under cups tucked into couch cushions, slipped into the fireplace logs by accident. He never mentioned them, just folded them gently and kept them in a drawer he didn't label. One afternoon, he'd found her sitting at the edge of the woods, legs tucked beneath her sketchbook in her lap. She didn't flinch when he approached, just kept drawing. A young fox by the look of it. She shaded in the fur carefully, every stroke deliberate. He stood a few paces behind, unsure what to say. The wind rustled the branches above, sending a scatter of leaves down between them. She finally spoke. "Do foxes stay in one place forever?" He cleared his throat. "No, not usually." She nodded once. "Makes sense." That was the most they'd said to each other all week. But it stayed with him because she hadn't asked about people. She'd asked about foxes. There's a kind of grief that doesn't wail or rage. It just settles, like dust on a windowsill. You stop noticing it until sunlight comes in and makes it glow. Walter wasn't sure if he was helping her, or if he even could. But he understood loss. He knew what it was to hold on to silence like it was the only thing left. He knew how a heart could keep beating even when the laughter had gone out of a house. Sometimes people think healing comes in loud revelations or grand new beginnings. But for Walter and Ellie, it began in something much quieter, an unspoken understanding. Neither of them tried to fix the other. They just existed, together, in the same house under the same roof, breathing the same mountain air. And in a world that moves too fast, maybe that kind of stillness is its own kind of rescue. It was the morning frost that first broke their rhythm. He'd stepped out onto the porch with his tea, same as always, but this time he noticed the prints. 3 small sets of paw tracks, leading from the tree line straight to his barn. He followed them with a strange sense of calm. Not urgency, not fear, just a quiet knowing something new had arrived. Have you ever shared your space with silence so long it started to feel like a second skin? Sometimes it takes the softest interruption to remind us we're still here. Let's keep going. The fog hadn't lifted yet, but the footprints were clear as if something wild had walked into their quiet world with purpose. The second morning of frost was always heavier than the first. That's what Walter's wife used to say. The first one is just warning she'd smile, standing at the kitchen window. The second's a promise. The ground had gone brittle overnight. Thin sheets of ice clung to the porch railing. Somewhere out in the trees, a red cardinal was already singing like it was spring. And that morning, when Walter stepped outside with his cup of tea, steam rising and bones a little slower than the sun, he noticed something that didn't belong. Tiny prints pressed into the silver crust of the earth. Not dog, not raccoon, not deer. 3 sets, close together, small, round, almost dainty except for the way they were spaced. Careful steps low to the ground. He knew those tracks. Years of forestry work had trained his eyes to read the ground like a story. These were bobcats, young ones, and they hadn't just passed through. They were headed straight for his barn. In the early months after Ellie arrived, Walter had cleared out the old barn. Dust tools, hay bales, long turned to mulch. It wasn't much of a structure anymore, leaning a little like everything else that had aged with him, but it was dry. Covered. Familiar. He hadn't kept animals in it since before the firewood business went belly up. The loft was now storage. A few sacks of feed, rusted hand tools, a rake missing its handle. Now apparently it was shelter for something else entirely. The fog still clung low, hanging between the trunks like it had forgotten where to go. He slipped on his boots, careful not to wake Ellie, and followed the trail. The prints weren't rushed. That surprised him. Most wild animals skitter-scatter, run like they're always being watched. These steps were deliberate, quiet, like whoever made them wasn't lost, just seeking. He reached the barn and slowly unlatched the side door. It creaked loud in the stillness. Inside, the light was gray-blue, filtered through slats in the old siding. Dust hung in the air like slow snow. And at first he didn't see them. But then a shape shifted in the shadows just behind the hay bales. Then another. 3 small bobcats tucked into the corner like orphaned ghosts. They didn't bolt, they didn't growl. They just watched him. The largest had one paw curled tight against its chest. Limping, maybe. Its ears twitched, but it didn't move. The smallest blinked slow, almost curious, the way some wild animals do when they're not quite sure if you're danger or help. The middle one, sleek, soft-looking, with a pale patch above its nose, just stared, eyes wide open. Walter didn't breathe. He stood there, heart steady, the way you do when you come across something rare and half sacred. It had been years since he'd seen bobcat kittens this close in the wild. He'd spotted them once in the Pisgah backcountry tucked under a fallen pine. He'd stayed low, watched from a distance, let them be. But now, here they were, on his land, choosing his space. He felt something stir inside. Not alarm, not responsibility even, just softness. You don't expect to feel that, not at 68, but it rose up in him as sure as the mist off the mountain. The thing about wild animals, especially babies, is they don't ask for permission. They don't need you to explain anything. They either trust you or they don't. And something about the way these 3 looked at him, nervous, yes, but not frantic, told him they were out of options. Their mother was likely gone. Maybe poached. Maybe lost to one of those new roads that cut through the mountain like scars. They had no business being alive this far into October on their own. Walter always believed you could learn more about a person by how they treat something they don't understand. Bobcats weren't dogs. You couldn't train them to sit or fetch or come running when you whistled. They weren't pets. They didn't want belly rubs. But that didn't mean they didn't feel fear, or hunger, or comfort. It's easy, he thought, to love what comes when called. Harder to love what stays just out of reach. He crouched slowly, knees crackling, and placed his old canvas jacket on the floor. A peace offering. The smallest one, the runt, crept forward almost without thinking. It placed one paw on the edge of the jacket, sniffed once, then backed away. Walter whispered, "That's all right, little one." He didn't try to coax or corner them, just stood back, heart humming, letting the barn settle again. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He left the door cracked open, walked back to the house and heated up leftover venison stew. By the time Ellie padded into the kitchen, still half asleep, the smell had already filled the place. She blinked at him across the table. "You're cooking." He didn't look up, just warming. She poured herself tea. sat quiet a while. Then, "There's something in the barn." He nodded. "I know." Another pause. "They're little." "Yes." Another sip of tea. Then she said something he didn't expect. "Can we keep them?" He let that hang in the air like fog over the fields. "No," he answered gently, "but maybe we can help them stay a little longer." That afternoon he brought an old heating pad out to the barn, set it under the blanket he'd laid the night before. The wind was picking up. Leaves skittered across the gravel like whispers. He didn't go in, just waited by the door listening. Inside there was movement, shuffling, a soft hiss, then silence. When he walked away, he smiled. They hadn't left. Have you ever had something wild? Choose your home without warning, without asking, and change everything just by being there. Sometimes we think we rescue animals, but maybe they find us, right when we need them most. By the end of the week, the kittens had names. Ellie called the curious one Clover. Walter named the limping one Rook. And the smallest, who always made a faint chirping sound when he saw them, became Whistle. They were still wild, still uncertain. But for the first time since the funeral, the house didn't feel empty. It felt watched, not intruded upon, just noticed. They didn't need collars to have names. Each one carried a story in the way they moved, the way they watched, the way they stayed. The days passed quieter now, but not in the way they had before. It was a different kind of quiet, the kind you lean into like standing beneath trees that filter the wind just right. A stillness full of tiny sounds. The padding of paws on old wood. The scratch of tiny claws against hay. The occasional chirp that almost sounded like laughter if you weren't listening too hard. The 3 bobcat cubs had, for reasons known only to them, decided not to leave. They didn't run. Didn't disappear into the forest like Walter expected they would. They stayed. And in doing so, they shifted something in the old house like a gear finally catching. It was Ellie who first named them, not all at once. It happened slow like sunrise over the ridgeline. The small one who chirped instead of growling, Whistle. The curious one with the white patch and bold paws, Clover. The limping one who never let his eyes rest, always watching corners and shadows, Rook. They were just names, but they stuck. Because Clover always ventured out first, brushing her side along the barn door like it belonged to her. Because Whistle followed Ellie when she walked the path behind the house, trotting a few paces behind, then hiding in ferns as if that made him invisible. Because Rook didn't trust the world, not yet, but had a way of keeping watch that felt responsible. One afternoon, Ellie sat out in the yard with a sketch pad. It had become a ritual of sorts. Walter would chop kindling or sweep the porch, and she'd be curled on the step's pencil, moving in small, sure strokes. This time Clover padded right up to her, no hesitation, and sniffed the edge of the notebook. Ellie didn't move. She just kept drawing. Whistle rolled in the grass, watching squirrels in the walnut tree, occasionally letting out that soft trilling sound like he was trying to mimic birdsong. Rook stayed near the barn, perched on a high beam, silent and distant, but present, always present. Walter watched from the porch. He remembered something his wife used to say about animals. "They'll show you who they are," she'd whisper, "if you're quiet long enough to let them. These weren't pets. They didn't come when called. They didn't sit at your feet waiting for scraps. They weren't loyal in the way a dog might be, but they were present. And sometimes presence is the rarest kind of loyalty." There was no transaction here. No reward, no trick, no leash. Just 3 wild hearts orbiting a house filled with quiet grief. And somehow the grief shifted. Not vanished, but softened. The way mountain snow melts from the edges, first slow and steady. Walter didn't ask much of the bobcats. He didn't try to tame them, didn't name them to claim them. But every time he saw Ellie crouched low in the grass with Whistle, or brushing hay off Clover's back, or quietly watching Rook as he limped through the field with that dignified determination, he saw something else too. He saw her coming back. Not all at once, not in the way some people expect grief to work, but in the little ways. The way she started humming while she drew. The way she left a piece of jerky near the barn door without saying anything. The way she looked up when Walter spoke even if she didn't answer. The bobcats weren't just wild animals, they were companions. Not the kind you talk to, the kind you listen with. There's something about bobcats. Something in the way they move low to the ground, quiet but confident. Always aware, always half a step away from vanishing. You can't own a bobcat. You can only be near one if they let you. And that made sense to Walter now. Grief was the same. You didn't master it. You didn't fix it. You didn't leash it. You lived beside it. You let it come close, sniff your hand, and decide for itself if it would stay. One evening, as they watched the sun go down from the porch, Ellie with a blanket around her knees, Walter nursing a chipped mug of coffee, she said something simple I think Clover dreams. He turned. Yeah. She twitches sometimes when she sleeps. Like she's running. Walter smiled. Maybe she is. A pause. Do you think they miss their mom? The words were soft but heavy. He didn't answer right away. Then I think they missed the way it felt to be safe. Ellie nodded, eyes forward. Me too, she whispered. The days grew cooler. Mornings came with frost on the steps. Walter repaired the barn door so it wouldn't creak so loud. Ellie lined the inside with old blankets and pine straw. She called it the den. And somehow that name stuck too. They never brought the bobcats inside, never tried to make them house companions, but the animals crept closer each day. Clover once stole a glove from the porch. Whistle curled beneath a rocking chair and blinked up at Walter like a sleepy cat. And Rook? Well, Rook never touched the porch, but he'd sit just beyond the firelight, eyes glowing like twin moons. Watching, always watching. Have you ever named something wild in your life, not to control it, but to honor its presence? Sometimes naming isn't about possession, it's about recognition, a way of saying, I see you. I remember you. You matter. By mid-November, things started to change. Rook stopped limping so much. Clover brought back a mouse, once dropped it at the barn. Threshold looked proud of herself. And Whistle, well, Whistle began to follow Ellie like a shadow. That's when Walter knew they weren't just visiting anymore. They were healing, and in their quiet way, so were he and Ellie. But healing, as he'd soon learn, doesn't always come without interruption. You can't cage a wild thing, but it still breaks you a little when it stops coming home. It happened the way changes often do, without fanfare, without warning. The mountains had gone quiet after a week of run. The sky turned pale gray, the kind that makes the trees look like they're holding their breath. And that evening, when Walter did his usual check of the barn, one of the 3 bobcats wasn't there. Clover, the bold one, the explorer, the one Ellie trusted most. The straw where she usually slept was flattened, still warm, but empty. At first, Walter didn't think much of it. She'd wandered before slipped off into the brush for a few hours, always returning before dawn. That was what bobcats did. They came and went as they pleased. Still, something in the air felt heavier that night. The fog hung lower, clinging to the ground. Even the crickets seemed muted. He told himself not to worry, but he left the barn door cracked open anyway. The next morning, Clover hadn't returned. By noon, Walter started checking the old animal trails that ran along the creek. It had been years since he'd followed tracks this closely, since his ranger days, when the woods spoke to him in small clues, broken twigs, bent grass, faint paw prints softened by dew. Ellie followed behind, quiet, her hands buried deep in her jacket. She didn't ask questions. She didn't have to. They found signs, a small patch of disturbed earth, the faint outline of tracks leading deeper into the valley. But no blood, no fur. Just distance. That was both the relief and the ache. It meant Clover was alive, but gone. By late afternoon, clouds began to move in, and the temperature dropped fast. Walter turned back toward the cabin. We'll check again tomorrow, he said, though it sounded hollow even to him. Ellie didn't argue. She just nodded and kept walking, her head bowed, her small boots making soft prints in the mud next to his larger ones. That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. Walter heard her moving around upstairs, the soft floorboards creaking. He stayed by the window watching the woods. The fog had rolled back in, swallowing the tree line whole. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, then silence. He thought of all the times he'd tracked animals like Clover before, how they always followed some invisible compass deeper into the wild. He knew enough about bobcats to understand they didn't get lost. They just knew when to leave. But knowing didn't make it easier. He remembered when he'd lost his old dog years ago, a shepherd named Boone. He'd buried him by the river, wrapped in a wool blanket. That night, he'd sworn never to get close to another animal again. Too much grief in love that can't speak back. And yet here he was, standing at the same window, worrying over something he was never meant to keep. Loss has a way of reopening rooms you thought were sealed. When Clover disappeared, the silence returned, not the heavy kind that marked grief, but the hollow kind that hums under your ribs. The kind that reminds you how much space love takes up when it's gone. Walter didn't talk much that next morning. He brewed coffee, burned toast, and kept glancing out the window as if he might see her by the fence line. Ellie stayed in her chair, sketchbook open but untouched. She'd drawn Clover dozens of times, always in motion, always mid-step. That morning, she tore the page out and folded it once before setting it on the windowsill. "For when she comes back," she said softly. Walter didn't answer, but he placed a small bowl of water by the porch steps that afternoon. Some gestures don't need explaining. There's a strange tenderness in letting something wild teach you how to wait. Walter realized that what he felt wasn't just worry, it was humility. Because loving a wild animal forces you to surrender control. You don't get to decide how long it stays. You don't get to build fences or make promises. You only get to offer kindness and hope it's remembered. And sometimes that's enough. He found himself talking quietly to the other two bobcats, Rook and Whistle, while he worked in the yard. Rook limped less these days, strong again, but still cautious. Whistle stayed near Ellie, chirping softly while she painted the old barn door a shade of pine green. Walter caught himself smiling once, just a faint curl at the edge of his mouth, as Rook batted at a loose glove that had fallen from his pocket. Even in absence, Clover had left something behind. A kind of alertness, a pulse. 2 days later, the fog lifted early. The morning light came in gold streaks through the trees. Walter went walking again, this time alone. He followed the ridge trail until it dipped near the hollow where the creek split. And there, under a fallen oak, he saw movement, a flash of tawny fur. It was Clover. She was crouched beside a small mound of earth, her head low, tail twitching. Walter stopped a few feet back. She didn't run. She didn't hiss. She just looked at him, her amber eyes steady. He followed her gaze and saw at what she'd been guarding. A fox cub, still and small, half buried in leaves. Clover made a low, throaty sound. Not anger, not fear, something gentler. "She stayed," he whispered, voice catching in the quiet. The cub must have been caught in the last storm, too weak, too young to survive, but Clover had found it, stayed beside it. Walter knelt slowly, hat in hand. He didn't touch her, just stayed there with her a while. When she finally stood, she didn't look back, just walked past him, silent, graceful, back toward the trees. And somehow he knew she'd return home that night. Walking back, he thought about the years he'd spent in service, tracking, rescuing, cataloging wildlife for reports that no one read twice. He'd measured everything by numbers, then territories, litters, lifespans. But there were no numbers for moments like this. A bobcat keeping vigil for another creature. A man watching it happen and realizing that compassion isn't a human invention. He thought of Ellie, how she'd asked if Clover missed her mother. Maybe she did. Or maybe she just understood loss when she saw it. Back at the cabin, Walter found Ellie on the porch, half dozing with Whistle curled near her feet. He sat beside her. "She's all right," he said simply. Ellie blinked, waking. "You saw her?" He nodded. "She'll be back tonight." And she was. Just after sunset, Clover appeared at the edge of the clearing. She moved slow, cautious, her fur damp from the creek. Ellie gasped softly and ran to the porch rail. Clover stopped a few yards away, eyes lifting toward them. Then she trotted toward the barn, slipped through the open door, and disappeared inside. No ceremony. No sound. Just the soft return of something that had been missing. And when Ellie finally smiled again, it wasn't wide or loud. It was quiet, but real. That night, Walter sat by the fire and thought about the strange balance of it all. Humans build fences to feel safe. Wild things walk freely and still find their way home. Maybe he thought healing isn't about holding tighter. Maybe it's about letting go with gentleness. He looked toward the barn window and caught the faintest flicker of movement, 3 small shapes curled together. He exhaled. For the first time in years, the sound wasn't heavy. Have you ever had something or someone wander from your life, only to return in a way that taught you what love really means? Sometimes the leaving isn't the end. It's the space that shows us how deeply we cared, and sometimes coming home isn't about place at all. It's about trust. By morning, the fog had lifted for good. The mountains stood clear again, bright against the sky. Clover, rook, and whistle slept tangled in straw as sunlight filtered through the cracks in the barn boards. For the first time in a long while, the cabin didn't feel like a place waiting for something to return. It felt whole. But Walter knew peace doesn't last without its tests. Because in the valley below, something else was stirring, a quiet threat he hadn't seen coming. He hadn't growled in days. That's when I knew something had shifted. Not in him, but in us. Some animals come close quickly. They trust with ease, drawn to warmth, a soft hand, a quiet voice. But others, they wait, they watch. And when they do finally step forward, it means something. Rook was one of those. The quiet one. The watcher. He never demanded attention like Clover or chirped like Whistle. He didn't bat at hanging strings or curl at your feet. He didn't play. He didn't ask. He kept his distance. But he always stayed close enough to see everything. From the very beginning, Rook had been the most guarded. Walter remembered how in those first days, the young bobcat would linger behind a pile of hay or perch silently in the shadows of the loft beams, just far enough to disappear if needed. Even as the other two warmed to the house, the barn, the people, Rook remained a sentinel. His limp had improved. The old injury, likely from a snare or an accident, had healed unevenly, giving his gait a soft drag. But it didn't slow him much anymore. He moved with purpose, now each step measured, each moment deliberate. Walter had come to respect that, maybe even see himself in it. One evening, just before supper, Walter was mending the low fence behind the woodpile. A storm earlier in the week had knocked down part of it, and the rails lay scattered among wet leaves. He'd driven in new posts, was tying fresh wire when he heard it. A soft scrape on gravel. Then a pause. He didn't turn, just kept working. The sound came again. Closer this time. And when he finally looked up, their rook was sitting a few feet away. One paw slightly lifted off the cold earth, head tilted. Watching. Waiting. Walter nodded once. "Didn't think you liked fences," he said softly. Rook didn't move, but his ears twitched and his tail gave one slow sweep across the ground. Walter smiled, quiet and to himself. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a strip of dried venison on a flat stone between them. Then he stepped back. Rook crept forward slow and steady and took it. No growl, no flinch. Just trust, tentative, but real. There's a kind of healing that doesn't show itself in big moments. No sudden wag of a tail, no dramatic leap into your arms. Sometimes it looks like a quiet animal standing a little closer than the day before. Sometimes it's just the absence of fear. Walter knew what it felt like to walk through life with your guard up. Not in a loud way, but in the way a man does when he's lost too much and doesn't want to lose more. He'd spent years not getting close. To people, to animals, to possibility. But Rook reminded him the ones who hang back are often the ones who've been hurt worst. And when they finally step forward, it means they've chosen you. Not because they need you, but because they feel safe beside you. That's a kind of grace you don't earn, you just receive. Later that week, Walter was in town picking up feed and nails when he ran into a man he hadn't seen in years. Bobby Clark, a Marine vet who used to come through the ranger station for backcountry permits. They'd shared a few beers once years ago. Bobby had never talked much about his time overseas. But that afternoon outside the co-op, they ended up standing beside each other in silence for a while. Then Bobby asked, "Still working with rescues?" Walter shrugged. "Not officially. Got a few visitors out at the cabin, though. Bobcats." Bobby raised his eyebrows. "Wild ones?" "Mostly." Walter smiled. Bobby stared at him a moment, then said something Walter wouldn't forget. "Sometimes the broken ones make the best guardians. Not because they're loyal, because they've seen enough to know what matters." Walter didn't say much after that, just nodded. But when he got home and saw Rook sitting near the porch, calm, present, tail curled neatly beside him, he thought about that line again. The broken ones don't protect because they're told to. They protect because they remember what it's like to be unprotected. Rook had begun patrolling the edge of the yard. Not every day. Not in the way a dog might barking at squirrels or chasing cars. No, Rook moved in arcs, methodical, wide circles. Always facing outward, always with his ears turning like tiny satellites. And when Ellie sat outside brushing clover or painting the barn or just sitting still, Rook would be there. Not touching, not cuddled close, but always within reach, always near enough to react. It was a quiet kind of love, one Walter understood all too well. One late afternoon, the three of them, Walter, Ellie, and Rook, were in the garden. Ellie was planting something early lettuce, she said, though it was mostly for the act of it. She liked her hands in the dirt. Rook lay in the shade, paws crossed. Ellie looked up at Walter and said, "He doesn't make noise anymore." Walter paused. "That a bad thing?" "No," she said. "Just, he used to growl when he saw us, even just walking past. And now..." She reached out slowly and touched Rook's back. He didn't flinch. "Now he blinks slow when I talk," she said, "like he's listening." Walter smiled. "Maybe he is. Maybe he knows I'm still figuring things out. Have you ever met someone or something that didn't speak but understood? The kind of presence that doesn't interrupt or fix, just stays close while you learn to breathe again. Sometimes the quietest companions hold the most space for healing. It wasn't long after that peaceful stretch that the knock came. A firm rap at the door just after supper. Walter opened it to find a man in uniform. Wildlife officer, not one he recognized. "There's been reports," the officer said. "Illegal trapping, signs of unauthorized feeding. You know anything about that?" Walter said nothing, just stepped outside and closed the door gently behind him. Behind him, through the window, Rook watched head-high, body still. Something had changed, not just in the bobcats, but in the world around them. And the peace they'd found. It might not be enough to keep them safe. Not everyone sees wild things the way we do. And sometimes the real danger isn't in the woods, it's the ones knocking at your door. It had been a season of stillness, soft, steady days. The kind where you think maybe this is it now. Maybe the hard part's past. Maybe the healing gets to stay. But peace, Walter had learned, is never something you own. It's something you borrow. And that evening, when the wildlife officer showed up, he knew the loan was about to come due. The man wore a clean uniform, the kind that looked like it hadn't spent much time in mud or brush. His name tag read Officer Denton, but it didn't mean much to Walter. He wasn't from around here. "Got a report from someone down the ridge," Denton said. "Said you've got wildcats on your property?" Walter folded his arms. "I've got wild everything on my property. It's the mountains." Denton didn't smile. "Bobcats. 3. Young. Said you might be feeding them or housing them." Walter didn't respond right away. Not out of guilt, but calculation. There was no law against letting wildlife pass through, but keeping them too close, that walked the line. And lines Walter knew could get redrawn whenever the wrong person was watching. Later that night, Walter and Ellie sat on the porch, a shared silence between them. The air smelled of pine and cooling earth. Somewhere in the barn, Clover shifted in the hay. Whistle let out his usual sleepy trill. Ellie asked, "Are they going to take them?" Walter didn't answer right away. He watched the tree-line eyes searching for something he couldn't name. "I don't know," he said. "But we didn't do anything wrong." "We didn't," he agreed. "But sometimes right and wrong don't matter much if someone's scared." She nodded, pulling the old quilt tighter around her shoulders. Rook lay beneath her chair, eyes open, ears forward, listening. Fear does strange things to people. It makes them suspicious of what they don't understand. It makes them want to control what doesn't follow their rules. And wild animals, especially the kind with teeth and claws, rarely fit into neat boxes. Walter had seen it before. Back in his ranger days, when neighbors would call in sightings like bobcats were threats just for existing. Predators, they'd say. But Walter had always thought of them differently. Not as killers, as survivors. Clover, Whistle, Rook. They weren't dangerous. They were displaced. They were looking for safety, just like any of us, really. Walter never claimed to own them. He hadn't tried to tame them. He didn't post videos online or parade them around town. What he offered was space. Food, yes, but not hand-fed. Shelter, but not captivity. A rhythm of quiet companionship, not control. And in return, they brought something into that cabin that no official report could measure. Ellie smiled again. She laughed. She spoke. That mattered more than rules drawn on paper by people who'd never sat beside a wild animal long enough to understand its silence. That week, Walter started preparing, not out of fear, but respect. He built an open-air enclosure near the tree line, large enough for the bobcats to wander in and out as they pleased, but protected enough to pass as a wildlife transition zone in case the state sent someone nosier. He spread pine needles, repaired fencing, hung old wind chimes in the branches not to scare but to mark space. Ellie painted a small wooden sign and nailed it to the fence sanctuary. Walter didn't correct her. The word felt right. Not a cage, not a zoo, a place where creatures could rest and still belong to the wild. One morning, Ellie stood by the fence line watching Clover roll in the leaves. She turned to Walter and asked, "If we let them go, will they forget us?" He took a long breath. "Maybe. But forgetting doesn't mean they didn't feel safe here." She nodded but didn't smile. "And if they don't come back," he placed a hand gently on her shoulder, "then it means we did our job." Have you ever let something go? Not because you stopped loving it, but because loving it meant setting it free. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for others and for ourselves is to offer a safe landing, even if we know it's only temporary. By the end of the month, things had settled again. Officer Denton didn't return. No letters came. But Walter knew that wasn't the end of it. Something had changed in the woods. Traps were being set deeper in the valley. He found one half buried under leaves just a mile from the creek. Someone wasn't just watching the bobcats, they were hunting, and Walter knew if he didn't act soon, he might not be the one to decide when the bobcats left. It wasn't a joke, it was joy. And when it rose up from the porch that afternoon, I realized I hadn't heard her laugh like that since the funeral, maybe even before. The morning had been a quiet one. The kind of cold that clings to your sleeves. Wood smoke in the air, low clouds brushing the mountaintops like they were trying to remember their place. Inside the cabin, the fire was already burning low when Walter came back from checking the fence line. The traps were still gone. He'd removed the last one 2 days ago, but that didn't mean someone wasn't coming back for them. He wiped the dirt from his hands, placed the kettle on the stove, and looked out the window. And that's when he saw it. Clover chasing a piece of cloth, one of Ellie's old bandanas, through the yard. Leaping, pouncing, twisting in midair with all the grace of a dancer. Whistle trailed behind, chirping like he was giving commentary. And Ellie? She was on the porch, laughing. Not the careful kind, not polite or small or quiet. A full, wide, head-thrown-back kind of laugh. And just like that, the world cracked open a little. Grief has a way of stealing sound. It doesn't just silence the room, it silences the people inside it. In the months since Ellie arrived, Walter had grown used to the hush. The way she moved without footsteps, the way she never raised her voice, not even in frustration. And for the most part, he matched her. But laughter. That was a different thing altogether. Laughter doesn't ask permission. It erupts. And when it does, it stirs everything. Walter stepped out onto the porch, boots landing soft on the old boards. Ellie didn't notice at first, too busy trying to wrangle the bandana back from Clover, who had no intention of letting it go. At one point, the cub leapt and twisted midair, stumbled awkwardly and knocked over a tin bucket. The clang rang out across the yard. Ellie clapped her hands and bent over, laughing again. Whistle ran in circles like he was proud of the chaos. Walter stood there, still heart swelling like the mountain air before a storm. He sat down in the old rocker, slowly, careful not to break the moment. Ellie looked up eventually, her eyes shining not with tears, but with something warmer, lighter. "She's ridiculous," she said, nodding at Clover, who was now chewing triumphantly on the bandana. Walter chuckled. "I've seen worse." Ellie smiled. "I didn't know bobcats could be funny." He looked out toward the trees where Rook sat at the edge of the clearing, watching it all like an old soul. "They're wild," Walter said, "but wild doesn't mean joyless." That landed between them like a small truth. Sometimes healing doesn't feel like a breakthrough. It feels like a laugh you didn't expect, a sound you forgot your throat could still make. It feels like watching a wildcat roll down a slope with a scrap of cloth and realizing you're smiling. You're alive in it. Not over the pain, not past the loss, but present, deeply present in a moment that isn't shaped by sorrow. Walter hadn't laughed like that in years. Not since before his wife got sick. And in that second on the porch, with the smell of frost and firewood and the echo of Ellie's laughter in the trees, he knew something had shifted. Not erased, but softened. There's a part of grief no one talks about. The guilt that sneaks in the first time you smile again. As if joy means forgetting. As if laughter is betrayal. But what the bobcats had taught them without meaning to was that joy is not the enemy of grief. It's the companion. It arrives quietly, often clumsily, wearing a ridiculous bandana like a crown. And it says, "You're still here. You still get to feel this, even in a place shaped by loss." Especially there. That night, after the sun dipped low and the air turned sharp, Walter found Ellie on the porch again. She was wrapped in the old plaid blanket, Clover curled beside her, eyes half closed. She held the bandana in her lap, frayed, muddy, full of tiny claw marks. "She can keep it," Ellie said softly, running her fingers along the edges. Walter nodded. She earned it. Rook was still out by the trees. Whistle had tucked himself between the barn wall and the woodpile. But the house, it wasn't quiet anymore. It was alive. Have you ever found yourself laughing in a moment you didn't expect and realized in that fragile joy that healing had already begun? Joy doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it tiptoes in disguised as play. Sometimes it has pause. The next few days settled into something close to rhythm. Not routine, because with wild animals there's no such thing. But rhythm, a heartbeat to the way they moved, the way Ellie smiled more easily, the way the porch creaked under 3 sets of paws each morning. And just when it felt like this might last, the bobcats began to change. They climbed higher, wandered farther. And one morning, Ellie found the barn empty, not abandoned, just quiet. The kind of quiet that means something is ending, or just maybe something else is beginning. They came wild. They left wild. But they took part of us with them. The morning they didn't come back felt different from the others. Not worse. Not better. Just inevitable. The straw in the barn was untouched, the water bowls still full. Even the bandana Clover used to carry from corner to corner lay folded near the wall as if she'd meant to leave it behind. Walter stood in the doorway longer than he needed to. He didn't call for them. Didn't walk the perimeter. He just stood there with his hand resting on the old frame, looking into the empty space where the bobcats had slept, eaten, wrestled, healed. He'd spent months preparing for this moment, telling himself it would come, telling Ellie it was what they were working toward. A successful return to the wild. A good ending, but it still felt like a goodbye. Not dramatic, not loud, just that quiet ache of knowing something's over. And it mattered. For days the signs had been building. Clover had started climbing the tallest trees, disappearing into the canopy for longer stretches of time. Whistle, always the smallest, had grown bold, hunting alone, returning with small mice laid neatly at the barn entrance like gifts. Even Rook, the most reluctant, had begun watching the horizon more than the yard. They'd been drifting back into themselves, returning to the wild instincts that were never truly gone. And Walter had let them. He'd stopped latching the barn at night, stopped laying out food, stepped back little by little, not as punishment but as permission. That afternoon, Ellie found him sitting on the porch looking out over the hills. "They're gone, aren't they?" she asked. Walter nodded. "Looks that way." She sat beside him, knees pulled to her chest. For a while, they said nothing. Then Ellie reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the worn page from her sketchbook. The one with all 3 cubs drawn in pencil, Clover leaping Whistle, crouching, Rook standing proud and still. She didn't unfold it, just held it pressed between her palms like a prayer. "They were never ours," she whispered. "No," Walter said gently. "But we were theirs. For a little while. It's strange how much space something can leave behind. Not physical necessarily, but emotional." The barn still stood. The field still stretched out golden beneath the autumn light. The cabin was still warm, filled with the soft rhythms of wood creaking tea-boiling wind pressing against the windows. But without the rustle of paws on hay or the sudden burst of a bobcat scream echoing through the trees, everything felt quieter. The kind of quiet that reminds you what mattered. The kind of quiet that holds memory, not absence. People talk a lot about rescue. Animal rescue, kitten rescue, wildlife rescue, bobcat rescue. But rescue isn't just pulling something from danger. It's knowing when to stop holding on. It's building a bridge between 2 worlds, a home and a habitat, and trusting that what you've given is enough for the animal to take the rest of the journey alone. This wasn't a story about taming wildcats. It wasn't about turning them into pets or changing who they were. It was about making space for them to be wild and still be loved. And maybe, in a quiet way, that's what every wild animal shelter hopes to do. Not keep, not confine. Just offer a pause, a breath, a moment of warmth in the cold season of survival. 1 week later, Ellie woke up before dawn. She padded down the stairs and found Walter already in the yard, a steaming mug in his hands, his eyes trained on the far fence. "Thought I saw something last night," he said without turning. She walked to the porch rail, blinking into the early light. 3 shapes, distant, barely visible through the trees, but familiar. They didn't come closer, didn't need to, just stood there watching, remembering. And then one by one they turned and slipped back into the forest. No goodbye, no theatrics, just a soft reminder we were here. And that was enough. The wild is full of tales we rarely get to see up close, but every once in a while, we're invited in not to change them, but to witness them. Clovers leap, whistles chirp, rooks slow blink. They weren't just cute animals or symbols of wilderness. They were part of something larger, a quiet thread that connects every creature searching for safety, for kin, for a place to rest. That's the gift of animal companionship, the kind that asks for nothing but gives something back all the same. Call to action, gentle, prompt for the viewer. Maybe you've had something wild pass through your life, a stray on your porch, a bird outside your window. Maybe even a person broken limping cautious like Rook who didn't stay but changed you. Take a moment to think about what that presence gave you and what you gave in return. If this story meant something to you, if it brought back a memory, softened a corner of your heart, or simply reminded you of what quiet kindness can do, consider supporting more stories like this. Click like, subscribe, and share this tale with someone who needs it today. And if you'd like to help us continue this work rescuing and rehabilitating wild animals like baby bobcats, preserving their natural dignity and freedom, tap the Super Thanks button or check the link below to donate directly to trusted wildlife rescue and animal documentary efforts. Your kindness helps build a world where even the most misunderstood wildcats can find a moment of safety before they return to the wild where they belong. And of the journey, but as always, the wild still has more to teach us. Stay with us. There's more ahead.